So then with no further ado, please give a big hand to our panelists, Florence, Jamel, Philip, and our moderator, Raphael. Amazing. Philip, Raphael, Philip, Florence, so many Philips. And the funny thing is, you know, for the Africans in the room and in the online audience, it's just a little anecdote. The name Philip has always given me so much struggle because I think there's 4 or 5 different writings of the name Philip, and you always like have to double, triple check that you get it right. So I hope we got it right this time around. And then let me hand over to you, Philip, or who still needs a microphone? Raphael. And yeah, we're looking forward to your panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael, for making the bridge. And welcome to the panel. I mean, you see already the topic. We touched upon it this morning. And I think being in Berlin, discussing the startup ecosystem in Africa, it's obvious that the comparison starts to happen, right? What are the differences between European and African startups? And that's what we want to dive deeper into in our discussion today. So to explore this question, we actually have a set of phenomenal people here on the stage. I want to welcome all of you very warmly. We start with Florence, who is the head of platform and operations at Launch Africa. We all know now it's the biggest VC that we have in the continent. And Florence was also running executive coach consultancy before that. So welcome, Florence. And then we move over to Philip. We had it this morning relating to the topic how important talent management is. And Philip actually is a serial entrepreneur, started now a new startup called OfferZen. And it's a marketplace for software developers. And what I've seen is that every week, you mentioned that more than 2,000 companies are looking to connect with thousands of developers in Africa. So that's fantastic. Welcome, Philip. Moving over to the next Philip. Philip Tettenborn, startup advisor at the German Agency for International Cooperation, focusing on agricultural tech, mentored over 500 entrepreneurs across 60 countries, and delivered projects, I think, in 25 countries as well himself. So I think you have a lot of insights really around what are the cultural differences as well here. And super excited to have also Jamel on stage. COO, co-founder of Senken. I've seen you pivoted from a very impressive retail career to now build a platform which gives access to climate tech financial assets. So that's great. And without further ado, I'd like to start with a quick round of intro, and maybe when you introduce yourself, you could already start talking about how and where did you experience differences between European and African startups?
Hi everyone, I'm Jamel and I'm the co-founder of Senken. We are building an exchange to bring together corporates, institutional investors and project developers on our exchange. So what you will find on our exchange is digital climate assets. We're starting with carbon credits in the digital form, but renewable energy certificates would be around the corner, as well as biochar, and then in the future biodiversity certificates would just be a very natural extension of that. And our vision is to bring as much capital as possible to the space by eliminating all the, from our perspective, unnecessary steps in between, and the people that just extract value without adding it where it's needed, which is also very much so in Africa, but generally like just in the southern hemisphere where the massive potential sits for that. And part of that vision is actually to redistribute wealth to the continent, which is kind of already going in that direction. We're based in Germany with an operational entity here in Berlin with an office, but we also have an office in Cape Town and have roughly, but between 15 and 20% of our team members are now already based in South Africa, which is great. That's for now the only country that we have team members in, but we hope to extend that soon. We've raised $7.5 million as our seed round last year in December. So we're now very much in building exciting stuff. differences, I think, is kind of the panel before us talked about access to capital a lot, which I think is probably the most significant one, combined with the network factor that was touched on as well. And the only thing that I would add to it is actually related to access to capital, which is valuation, especially for very successful growth stories, because if the valuation is too low at the beginning, then it will be very tough to catch up at a later point in time from a founder's perspective and a cap table perspective. So I think that's something that we shouldn't underestimate. It's great that we get in cheap at the beginning, but that will be hard to actually make up, especially if there are then great projects there. They just won't be interested, they won't be interesting for international investors because they're just already too diluted at that point. Handing over to Florence.
Thank you. I'm Florence. I'm head of platform and operations at Launch Africa. You've heard quite a lot about us today, but I'm going to add a little bit of different perspective. As you'll know, we have a really big portfolio, and we're planning to at least double that over the next 2 years. What does that mean? That means that we still need to add value to our founders. We need to have our exits. They need to be able to raise their next rounds. And we can't do that if we don't have an efficient way of adding that value, a way that we can still be a small and agile team, but make sure that our founders can have contact with us regularly, whenever they need it, and with the GPs, not just with the investment and portfolio team. The biggest singular differentiator I see between European startups and African startups is the sheer size and delivery of ambition. So if I think about one of our portfolio companies, MarketForce, they are solving problems, taking payments, very basic level, for informal traders, which is 80% of all retail in Africa. If I think about what that looks like in Europe, it probably looks like iZettle, right? It's a card payment piece of hardware, and then you can also do card payments online. People think that from outside the ecosystem, that African investment and startups and VC is all about just rinse and repeat North America, rinse and repeat Europe. That's not what it is. What it is the best founders in the world looking at problems they have, seeing how it's been done, and then thinking, okay, I'm going to solve that. But I'm also going to solve all these problems around it. And what MarketForce do is, yes, they provide a super app which allows these traders to take payments, but they also fulfill all of their digital and physical stock in their shops. They provide invoice financing, and they create a retail super app that empowers these traders to be able to grow their businesses. And they're taking over the continent, and you don't see that in Europe. Handing over to the Philips.
Thanks, Sam. Is this thing on? No. Okay, well, I'm Philip One. As I was introduced, I'm the co-founder of a company called OfferZen. We're a marketplace for companies in South Africa, Netherlands, and Germany to hire software engineers. We started 7 years ago now. We started in South Africa. Before that, I ran a kind of, I guess you could call it a venture builder with my brother. We basically started a whole bunch of different companies, and most of them didn't work out, as you would guess. But we got lucky and had a couple of successes. We had a mobile payments company called SnapScan, which is pretty successful in South Africa, and we actually started the biggest crypto exchange in Africa as well, Luno. So basically we did that, and then we decided, hey, we really like this idea of the fact that you have talented people everywhere, but they don't necessarily have opportunities. And the fact is that these people are sort of equally distributed across the globe, but the opportunities are not. And so that was kind of, I guess, the impetus for OfferZen. Now we're here. We're operating in Germany and Netherlands and South Africa. The biggest difference, I guess, the whole day has highlighted a bunch of differences. So I'll focus something on brand for us, which is on the talent side. So the difference in talent between Africa and Europe. Obviously, there's significant differences. I'll give you some numbers. So in Africa in total, there are about 700,000 software engineers. In Europe, there are about 5 million software developers. So there's obviously a huge difference. Then if you look at sort of the what does that talent look like, that also looks very different. So if you look at Europe, you obviously have people that, there have been many successful companies here. There have been, scale-ups, companies that have IPO'd, exited, and there's this deep pool of talent there, of people that can scale these businesses. So just if you're a founder listening to this thing, my advice would generally be and specifically if you're based in Africa, which is it's really, really great building out a team with African developers. They're far cheaper, they're far hungrier, they work way harder. There's lots of reasons to do that, but as you start scaling, you definitely need to think about adding some expertise in from Europe as well. Cool.
Right, I am the other Philip T, let's say, not Philip 2. So I work for GIZ, a German government organization that does the development cooperation work for Germany. And the project I work in is called SISE, Scaling Agriculture Innovation Through Startups. So we work with digital startups that offer solutions along the agriculture and food value chain across Africa. So we have been supporting over 70 companies by now in over 20 African countries. With a big focus on Kenya and Nigeria. And maybe quickly about myself, so I worked in the Berlin tech startup scene in the beginning of my career, so I was a founder myself, and then switched to the other side as a supporter and cheerleader of companies in an incubator at the university, and then worked more internationally around the world, and then for the last 2 years have been with GIZ focusing on the African continent. And I mean, as the other panelists, I think we have been talking about differences, similarities, and bridges for the whole day already. So I think we'll have a tough time to really get to even more interesting nuggets. But I think one key difference that I see, maybe also from an advising perspective, as that's the one that I usually have, is what Florence touched upon, the strategic focus, or how you see the different areas and the different value propositions that you provide as a startup. So I think every startup founder by nature is very opportunity driven. So you see something, you jump on it, you want to solve that. And I think in the European context, usually it's really, okay, hyper focus. Don't do left, don't do right, concentrate on the one thing and do that to the best you can. And I think that just doesn't work in the same way on the African continent, what we just heard. So there's more the ambition we want to build is super app. We want to be the ones that solve all the different challenges for the one target group that I am addressing. And I think that's a big difference. And we've been wrestling with that quite a lot, because we also heard that efficiency in certain areas. So if we look at agriculture, the efficiency of the agricultural processes on the continent is a lot lower than in other regions of the world. And we heard from Junaid also in the morning about the stadium example. So this also comes because you have logistic challenges, you have numerous challenges along the value chain, and if you only solve one point in the value chain, the rest is still not as efficient. So that actually doesn't make the whole value chain more efficient. So how do we tackle that? And so from a GIZ perspective, we try to really bring together different solutions in value chains and put them seamlessly into one process, so that you can end-to-end really deliver data end-to-end and have smart processes and have technology that really then solves the whole value chain issue and not only one single thing. So I think that's something, at the moment, a lot of startups are still hesitant to collaborate too closely with too many players, because it gets complicated the more people you have involved in a process. But I think we'll hear later from Sebastian, a project called Motherland, also a project that we support and work together with, where we say, how can we strategically orchestrate these solutions and make the whole value chain more efficient. So I think that's something I'm really excited about, and I think there's huge potential.
Cool, fantastic. So many things we can touch upon already, and I think one topic that we heard already a couple of times today is that we see startups who have hybrid setups, right? They have operations running in Europe and then also in Africa, maybe in Cape Town, Lagos, Nairobi, etc. And we have here two founders who actually have that setup in their companies. What were the main challenges or main learnings that you had together to scale, right, from one continent to the other? And what would be an advice that you would give to other founders who are maybe standing in the same situation right now?
I'll probably start. My co-founder is actually based out of Cape Town. His girlfriend is from Cape Town, so therefore that's where they settled. So that was kind of our natural contact point initially, and now we couldn't be any happier about that connect, basically, right? And that hybrid setup is kind of the best of both worlds, to say the least, and we see huge potential for the future to actually tap into that. I think the previous panel already touched on some of the problems. Obviously, they're like IP related, sometimes they're regulation related, etc. But if you have a very smart setup from the start, then I think you can actually bring the strength together. So in our case, we, as I've already alluded to, we are now an American holding company that has a German operational entity and now the South African one. So the IP is kind of protected, but everyone else within, including the South African entity, is actually benefiting to the same extent from everything that we create value-wise. So our South African employees actually have company shares that are related to our overall value and they're not separate from it. So I think it was touched on, talent is absolutely amazing and like how eager they are, couldn't be any happier with that. And I think there's somewhere in between. So I think the part that was touched on from the efficiency point of view, I think there's a correlation from my personal perspective, at least, with the fact that labor is actually significantly cheaper. So in a way, there is no pain point to solve, at least not imminently, because you can kind of afford having 3 people working on it with a similar-ish kind of turnaround without getting more effective. That's like just a little side story, but I do actually have a hospitality business as well and a coffee shop. And whenever I'm in Cape Town, which I absolutely love, the best places are still so crowded with team members that are highly inefficient, even though I love those places to bits. But there are just too many people stumbling over each other. And that, again, is actually related to the labor fact, right? I think they could be so much better, even better than they already are, by being slightly more efficient without having to have that probably a little bit overplayed German way of looking at it, because I think we're probably too far the other side.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the question is kind of, I guess, how do you make it work? So in our case, we started in South Africa. Our expansion to the Netherlands actually involved us acquiring another business, and so that's how we got the first Dutch people on board, which was certainly an easy way to kind of overcome some of the cultural barriers, because you now have someone in your team. I would say it's not necessarily, so obviously there's all the legal things that you need to figure out, but if we just ignore those, I think a large part of it is also just how do you manage the company culture across 2 different regions where the labor laws are different, where expectations in terms of how you work, how you show up at work, those kinds of things are kind of different. That's tricky. And then I think the last one, maybe to add to that, would be I guess there's a couple of aspects. So I think like compensation's always very tricky when you're in multiple regions. If you have the same role in multiple regions and you have different salaries, then employees get unhappy. So that's a really, really tricky one. And then I guess related to any company that's working remotely, because fundamentally you've committed to some version of remote work when you're operating in multiple regions. I guess the standard things around remote work definitely make sense. Having a company, well, depending on your size, but assuming let's say you get to like 50 plus employees, having a very, very comprehensive company wiki that has all the things written down, I guess if you have people working in one office making decisions, if you centralize too much power in one area, you basically have an office that kind of feels like they're the duds, and they just get told what to do. You need to think about all of those things. But I think if I don't know how many of those problems are unique to operating, in Africa and Europe versus just it's really hard running a decentralized organization, and you need to do the things required to do that, and you need to be very, very careful about how you make decisions, how you communicate decisions, because the sort of the coffee conversation that you have, or the water cooler conversation, or whatever it is, if that all happens in Cape Town or all happens in Amsterdam, that has very, very large negative effects on the team.
Just one point to add, if I may. I think the diversity aspect is something that I just want to highlight as well, and not just from a buzzword marketing perspective, but actually, so we're a climate tech startup, and a lot of the climate projects are actually in the Southern Hemisphere, or i.e. in that case, the African continent. And very often as founders or as startups, we assume that we understood the problem that actually is relevant in the respective geographies, where in fact those problems might actually be very different. So we already saw a huge value add from our African team members that actually highlighted a few things that we definitely would have missed if we wouldn't have had that on board. So there's a massive, massive aspect there as well that definitely does make us better as a business, not only from a talent perspective.
You actually make the perfect bridge to the next question. So talking about culture, being the DNA of how we think, act, behave, what kind of specific cultural or social elements do you see that are shaping how African startups think, and maybe what is the difference to how European startups act? And Philip, you've been working across so many cultures and countries. What is your perspective on that, and what kind of differences do you see there that are influencing strategies of startups and really how they act in their day-to-day?
Yeah, complex question. And I try to see people not by, you come from this place or this place, but rather the person. So I think culture has so many layers. So I think there's national culture, there's family culture, there's personal culture. We all know that. But I think that I know like very accurate people from the Philippines, and then I know very, joyful people from Germany, but like if you talk about, they exist. I promise they exist. But I think you touched upon a point which I feel I struggle myself with, being an employee of a government organization in the end, a private organization, but mainly funded by the government, that Germans are like really like this. We have this planning focus that we like to plan out everything. And of course, that's nice in a way because you have a roadmap, you have a contingency plan, A, B, C, and so on. But you lose the flexibility, of course, and you lose you lose a lot of innovation, actually, I believe, which is absolutely a problem of large organizations, but also of certain cultures. And I think Germany is definitely on the far end of like the very planning heavy ones, right? And I think then on the other side, you have the just being used to improvise. I think that sounds very generic, but I think that's definitely a huge quality, that you just see a problem and you have the confidence that you'll find a way, even though you don't know yet how it's going to work out. And that's something that I think Germans are not really good at, and a lot of other cultures are pretty good at, just having the confidence, okay, I'm gonna figure this out. I don't know yet how, but I'm gonna start and do something about it. Having that drive, that entrepreneurial drive to tackle problems. I mean, we talked about Lagos before. I think if you have been to Lagos, to certain areas, you really feel, okay, there's so much entrepreneurial drive of the people, and problems are manifold, but you just tackle them and solve them, right? So I think that's probably a very generic one, but that's definitely a big difference that I see. And it's not to be underestimated, that difference, especially if you're working as a German organization or a German investor with a startup, let's say from Nigeria. Like, how do you communicate about that? How do you make OKRs? How do you talk about goals, about plans, and how do you find a common ground? I think that needs a lot of cultural awareness on both sides, and really making it explicit and talking about this, which I find is really, really important. And also being able to reflect on your own style and going away and not saying this is how we do it and please adapt. That doesn't work. And I think there's a lot of issues an international cooperation that comes from those underestimated cultural differences. So I could talk about this all day, but maybe that as a first. Yeah.
And I think it relates perfectly to what you mentioned at the beginning, Philip, of the value chain problem that we have, right? The stadium example, where suddenly you need to not only solve for one problem, but you dig deeper, you have an underlying problem, first layer, second, third layer, and you really need to have this builder's mindset and resilience and flexibility to just tackle it and solve it through support organization. I think that's one of the things that I see personally is really the theme, I think, of today, support, trust between the community. I think it's really strong in Africa because, you know, if I solve the problem, not only me will benefit from that. Let's say having a database for making credit checks, but many others might benefit from the too and build on top of it. So I think that's a perfect example here. Florence, you had something
Yes.
to add.
I'm glad that you spoke first because you mentioned flexibility and support. And as a VC, we want to be able to support our founders, but not all founders are the same. Not all founders have the same problems. Not all founders are in the same market. We're in 22 different countries. And so we want to be able to flexibly support our founders, and then we hope that approach trickles down for them as well. So I was speaking to one of our founders the other day. One trolley, by the way, if you want ice cream to your door within 2 hours, still frozen in Egypt. Those are your guys. And they're great. He's so great at being in the business. Fantastic. So on it with reporting, everything. The business is growing. GMV up 756% in 1 month from one partnership they've got recently. And it's going to keep growing. It's not a blip. But when it comes to fundraising, in so much need of support. And as a VC, we're really looking at how are we tailoring that support flexibly to our founders, and how are we showing them that approach, and how are we then facilitating them to do the same to their team and leading by example.
Well, I'll start with myself to give context. So my father's Algerian and my mom is German, so I kind of grew up in that kind of mixed culture environment, even though I was born and raised in Germany. So that definitely helps a lot. And then my professional journey brought me into, well, across Europe, but then I also spent some time in Saudi Arabia, which was very, very different to how business or communication is done. And coming back to the topic, I think it's about embracing the differences and tapping into being aware of them, right? So where are potential gaps, and then acknowledging them, and then actually addressing them proactively, and getting support, because there's always support available, usually a lot less hard than you anticipate. And I think that's something that, as long as you embrace that very, very early in, could become like a superpower, actually. And I quite often kind of struggle to actually use culture, even though it kind of makes sense to do that in that context. But I love to talk about core values, because that actually travels way better across continents and languages and so on. And whoever traveled somewhere where you didn't know anything about the language, you were still able to kind of communicate. And I think that's based on core values. Obviously, that's a little bit romanticized if you can run a business just based on that. But I think there's something in there that you can actually utilize and, as I've said, embrace the differences and have core values aligned. Be aware of the gaps that you might have. And as long as you address them, I think you're in a really powerful position.
It's great to hear some of the commonalities that we have and really the core values that can be shared no matter where you are. But I think we also have an elephant in the room and really a gap that we could talk about. And that gap is basically access to money, access to funding, right? There is a gap when it comes to investments. We've seen that there's a tremendous momentum right now for the African startup ecosystem, 6 to 7 billion last year. But there's a difference still. Florence, maybe you can talk to us about what initiatives do you see are being undertaken right now to bridge that gap a little bit, right? And make the access to funding to really kick off the first operations, or really work on that MVP from the beginning.
Yeah, access to funds is a really difficult one, and also access to debt I think that's where we see a big difference between European and African founders, is that access to debt in Europe is so much more available. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, we'll go with problems, then we'll go with solutions. So then other challenges, I think, challenges for African founders is that the biggest challenges, like inflation, currency, when we think about like government, conflict, all of these things are so out of their control. And that's really difficult. And then somehow, and this is something a European entrepreneur never has to do, is they never ever have to explain the marketplace to an investor before they explain what their product is and what it's solving. And so when it coming back to accessing funds, being able to hone your pitch in a way that succinctly contextualizes your market and the ecosystem that you're in, and then how your product fits within it, in a way that is digestible in one slide and doesn't put someone off, is such a key and underestimated skill for getting funds. Because if you don't get that first conversation, you're never going to get to IC. And when we think about the deck, that deck we put so much worth into, and we think that's going to get us to the IC, but no, that deck just needs you to get to the conversation so that you convert that analyst that you're talking to, and then they convert the team, you get to the pipeline review, and it all goes on from there. So somehow working to how you contextualize your market, how you contextualize the risk, and how you tell the story of your product is key to accessing those funds. Where would you like to go next, Raphael?
Maybe another element, again, taking the role of the public sector. So I think in Europe, you have, especially in Germany, you have a lot of public funding as well. So we look at private funding and we look at public funding. And in Germany, you pretty much have the pipeline from first ideas coming from university to pre-incubators, incubators, first public funds. It's a whole pipeline that is built from the public sector as well, and for the private sector. The public sector usually jumps in parts where they feel, okay, on our political agenda, we want to progress certain sectors or certain types of businesses we want to support. I think then on the African continent, it's not, of course, also have public initiatives, and we talked about startup acts being like assembled in many countries, but then you have, I think the equivalent to the public funding almost is like the foundations, the GIZs and so on, all with grant offers, or like also with like subsidized debt, etc. And I think there is really important for entrepreneurs to understand what is the right money for me and what is not the right money, because it's really hard from own experience as an entrepreneur to say no to free money, right? And you feel, okay, I'll just somehow arrange my pitch deck so I fit into this bucket, and then I get funding which doesn't really fit my business, and then I'm in this spiral of like trying to comply with goals that shouldn't be my goals actually, because I from the beginning don't fit into the right bucket. So not to get too abstract, but this is something which I've seen a lot in my life, and I think that is really important to be transparent from both sides, and to, again, we come back to trust. So having both sides that trust each other and understand, are we a good match or not? And I think in the private sector, you have that a lot better through like the typical due diligence processes, which a lot of the other organizations don't do to that extent. And I think we see that ourselves, so we have to be present on the ground. We have GIZ offices all over the world. We take local experts in, we take investors in to do this first due diligence, and we visit the startups that we work with in the very, very beginning to just build a personal relationship, what we talked about, understanding what are common values, how do we actually work together, do we really understand how we can make the best of this collaboration? And I think that's really a key point, understanding public funding in the European side, what's the equivalent of like what should be subsidized, which kind of sectors or which kind of businesses need additional support, and how do you tailor make that support that it really fits to the needs of the company. So it should, last point, it should really be led by the startups themselves. That's my philosophy. The startups themselves should decide what kind of capital do I need and what do I need it for, and not some guideline of some person that wrote it in their ivory tower and said, okay, this is what we're going to spend the money for. little controversial, but from a GIZ person, but that's really my personal opinion and really important, I feel.
Thanks for the honesty. And wow, lots of hands-on advice, really, right, for founders and all our audience also who's joining us digitally, in terms of contextualizing, keeping your eyes open, networking, knowing what type of investment funding really fits. I was asked that we should open up for the Q&A right now. So
Can I just add one thing to this? I want to add another controversial opinion. So the elephant in the room is there's not enough money. My stance is there is enough money. Startups just suck at accessing the money. So yeah, there's a ton of money. People want to invest in Africa. The problem is that African founders, they're not in an environment where they know how to speak to investors. And so I lived in Silicon Valley for 2 years, and my experience arriving there was, and going to some meetups and meeting some people, was like, holy shit, these people are just so smart. Everyone there is just smarter than me. And the reason why is they speak so eloquently. They have Silicon Valley speak down. They know how to pitch. They can tell you about their breakfast in a compelling way where you're going, I want to invest in that bloody breakfast. And the thing is, like, African investors are kind of the opposite. It's kind of what you were saying about the ice cream store, or not the ice cream store, the ice cream delivery services. They're way better at building businesses than they are at convincing people that their businesses are good. And I think you can really make a very big difference if you could just, like, I don't know, just like instill that culture. I don't know if it's necessarily culture, but instill that knowledge. Is the implicit knowledge. It's kind of like if you go have a fancy dinner, there's different knives that you need to use and different forks for different things, right? You know, like, this is the fish knife or whatever it is. And it's kind of like that. It's like it doesn't really mean anything, but it means something to investors. It gives them a sense of comfort that you're speaking their language, that you're using the right terms for the metrics you're talking about. And when they say, like, what's your logo retention, not like staring at them blindly and going like, what the hell is that? It's like knowing what logo retention is. So if you can, I think there's a huge amount of capital that's available if we could get that right. Anyways, that's my controversial opinion.
let's maybe open it up not only to questions but comments to some of the opinions that we have. And I see already hands being raised. Looking forward to a good discussion around that.
Hi, my name is Mamutiane Mutle. I am South African, but now living in Berlin. I think I have questions for Philip, number one, Philip, number two. Well, I've been lucky. I've worked as a business process analyst in South Africa in management consulting for over 10 years. And I have also started a company there, and I've had the opportunity to come to Germany and become a managing director of a digital startup that actually did a lot of work with German agencies like GIZ. So my first question is on resources, and actually because what we had to do post-COVID was to actually hire developers from South Africa and also work with developers from Germany, and also now we had developers from Ukraine as well, which in itself has a lot of challenges because you have to deal with load shedding, whether it's in Ukraine or it's in South Africa. And you also have the issue about how do you employ them? You employ them in South Africa, you pay them in South African rands versus their counterparts that are in Germany with the same skills getting paid in euros. My question to you, Philip, number one, is how do you manage that in your company, and how do you advise companies that have resources across continents where that is an issue?
Right, so I guess there's a lot of nuance to that question, so it's hard to just say a general thing, this is how you should do it. I guess if we just answer a question generically to start with, I guess there's so which entity is employing them? So you can either have a South African entity, or you can use an employer of record like Remote.com or Deal, or one of these companies. That's the sort of, I guess, how to legally employ them. In terms of paying them salaries, I guess it depends on what you're optimizing for. I think if you're trying to attract talent and you're willing to do it, then I would say probably the best way would be to pay euros. because that's essentially like a safety buffer in against currency worsening. So again, it depends on what you're optimizing for, but if you want to attract the best talent, I would definitely suggest paying in euros.
Okay, thank you. And Philip, too, my question is actually about doing business with...
Philip T, not Philip T.
Oh, two. I thought... sorry about that. The question I have is actually how do you get to work with startups, especially African startups, or while doing business with GIZ? Because there are very strict processes, procedures, and how you can get a tender in. But my experience as well is that the best teams that I have built, it's teams, especially it was mentioned earlier, that in Africa, more UX, UI design is stronger than in Europe, versus Europe where more the technical skills are stronger. So in a lot of projects that we've worked with, we've had to have teams that are purely European, and therefore the solutions were never quite adopted in the African countries because they didn't quite represent the people that we were designing for, but the knowledge was very limited because of how you have to build up your team to make the minimum requirements, let's say, of GIZ.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I hear you, and that's a very common problem. I think having a solution that is designed in Germany for Nairobi, I mean, by definition, probably won't work, right? So I think what we do differently is that every company that we work with has to be founded on the African continent, and the companies approach us. So that's very important to us. So we have a call for applications where we explain pretty clearly how we can support the companies, but it's important that they are based on the African continent. They already have somehow a proof that their solution works, so it's post-revenue, and they have a clear scaling ambition. So this is the kind of companies that we work with. The reality is some companies have development teams also outside of Africa. So one of the companies we work with has a development team in India, for example. Or another one, which unfortunately couldn't be here today, they have their development team headed in Berlin, and then developers all over the world, actually. So to answer the question, the technicality of like you need a certain amount of like European or German service providers, etc., doesn't apply to us. That applies to us how we build the support system for the startups. So what we do, we like to see ourselves as like an a la carte menu for startups to choose from. So we have a digital agency that was based in Nairobi, for example. Now we actually have one that is based in Northern Africa that works with the startups, but that always has local employees of the service providers also working with the startups. So the tech agency would work with the startups on their technical solutions. And we have what we call ecosystem integration. So in all the major ecosystems, we have collaboration partners, local ones, who have the best connections to the ecosystem, to experts, to co-working spaces, and so on. So while we are a German project working Pan-African, we work mainly virtual, but we have a lot of partners on the ground that we work very closely with. And that's very important. Otherwise, we couldn't do the work. And also for us, I think it's very important. Half of the colleagues lived on the continent, the others not. So I've traveled a lot of places, but I haven't lived actually in Africa. And I'm also like mixed, so I'm half Colombian, half German. So I think that helps to untangle some of the differences. But yeah, just maybe to answer that question. So for us, it's startup-led, the whole process. So the startups decide what do we want to work on together, and we are there on the sidelines, assisting, advising, and just helping them to reach as many people as possible with their solutions. Hope that answered the question.
Unfortunately, I was ordered to end this panel because we have been on constant overtime today, which shows that there's so much conversation potential. And I just want to hand out a big thank you to you guys for the insights between the continents.